Peoples, what's up? Welcome back to Shelf Story, the channel that tells tales from games, books, and life. I am your host, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us for this latest episode of Good Trouble. Yes, this is a Good Trouble episode. Yeah, Lauren is excited to get in some good trouble herself. This is great. This is the series of episodes where I engage in conversations above the table that are relevant to gaming in a spirit of education and compassion, as we were talking about before the call. So this episode is a follow-up to the episode that I did with Senfun Lim on Stop Asian Hate. So if you enjoy that conversation, thank you so much for people who have provided feedback. It was a tough one for sure. And, you know, I think some people had some different reactions to it, but I think on the whole, especially among, you know, people in the Asian American community, Pacific Islander, Indian, they came back and they said, wow, thank you so much for highlighting that voice. Do the best that we can. But definitely realized we were talking about an incident that involved females and we were two men speaking. So my esteemed guest reached out to me, just reached out to me. We don't know each other, so we just kind of are connecting. And she said, you know what, we need to kind of fill in some gaps. And I said, you know what, that's absolutely right. So I'm absolutely pleased to welcome Lauren Nepo. I'm choking. I practiced this the entire time, but now I'm choking.
You got this. You got this, Jason. You got
Lauren
this.
Nepomuceno from XYZ Game. Oh,
there you go.
There it is. Lauren Nepomuceno from XYZ Game Labs. She is the director of communications over there, and you may know her from being around the social media verse. So, Lauren, thank you so much for reaching out, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and you got my last name right. We'll just say that's correct.
I got in my own head. I'm like, I got this. It's like, oh, that's terrible.
It trips you up, you know. 10 letters, consonant, vowel throughout. It could be a little tricky, but yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this is a a really important conversation, I think, sure. And something that Sen did a great job, by the way, talking about, the Asian experience that we're kind of going through as this is, these unfortunate events are unfolding. But it's a little bit different, being a woman and being also Asian American and that intersectionality there, right? The layering, if you will, that leads to that experience. So I kind of wanted to, chime in a bit, if you will.
And it was very brave. We don't know each other. And this is not something that, I was very careful, right? I mean, I didn't want to do the thing where it's like, okay, let me ask the Asian American women that I see or whatever, like the native of Atlanta who happens to be in the word. You gotta be careful with this stuff. So I think in a way, mission accomplished of like, we highlighted it and now people feel more comfortable in engaging. So the topic today is particular to Asian stereotypes. So we talked a lot about Asian stereotypes with Sen. And now, when it came to females, there is a particular cluster of stereotypes that we are going to engage in and talk about that, that's relevant to board gaming people. I mean, I'm sorry. Like it is in our people as we interact. It is in our iconography. It is in our images and everything in there. So it is in a spirit of education and compassion. So we are going to try to tread carefully, but thoughtfully. So that's going to be the main purpose of the show. And I'm going to try to adopt as much of a listening posture as possible. So I know I like to talk, but I'm going to try to give Lauren, the center spotlight. However, let's talk about you first. Let's introduce you to the audience. You are the director of communications for XYZ Game Labs. Maybe you could talk about your work and, some of the stuff you do there.
Yeah. So, based in Chicago, Illinois, born and raised in Chicago my whole entire life. Grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, actually, for Chicago, despite its redlining and segregation and history of that. Grew up in a very diverse neighborhood. But yeah, at XYZ, I am the director of communications. So I write the emails, I do the social media posts, I reach out to press, I help coordinate all of that. Also, am involved with all the events. So you'll see me at whatever conventions I feel brave enough to attend, once I'm vaccinated, all that stuff. And then I've also, since we are a lean team, we are a small indie publisher. So I also take careful and attentive details into, some of the artwork and the representation of the characters and maybe the thematics of it, and truly understanding, the audience that we're trying to target. So that may include, hiring culture consultants, interviewing people from the community.
I'm available. My rates are reasonable.
Yep. Understanding really, being involved with the community. So our latest game is Art Travels, which is a game about knitting and crocheting. So I joined every single knitting and crochet group on Facebook to really understand the culture and to really understand the memes, understand the language, understand, the jokes, understand that entire world so that we can build a product that speaks to them, right? And yeah, so I love that kind of stuff. I love the culture investigation, the anthropological approach of like product design and game design. So, and I think it makes for a better product too. So, yeah, that's something I like. And, I've been, very, not negative per se, but I've been very cautious and a little bit more like, I don't know, sensitive to, the ideas of like cultural appropriation in games too, right? So I kind of see that. And, so some of my friends or some people in the industry have reached out to me like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And, I want people to succeed. So, if I think it's, maybe bordering something, I'm like, all right, here's how you should probably approach this. But first of all, involve cultural consultants early on. That's all I have to say.
Do not skip on the price. You will absolutely get that money back. It is an investment in your game or your product. You will get that money back in the time that you will not spend dealing with problems later.
Yes,
like the eyes early on something will result in extra bandwidth, extra brain space for you later. And yes. I have begun to do cultural consulting work. So please, my rates are reasonable. I've already gotten a couple of jobs under my belt, including one that has a huge NDA attached. But I'll talk a little bit more that down the road. But I absolutely 1000% vibe with you right there.
Yeah, and it's important too, because really if you're making a game, especially if it's like based off of specific ethnicity or culture, people from that ethnicity and culture could smell the ingenuity if it's not done right. Like they could smell, like if it's not done right, like,
is that a tribal tattoo? Is that
like
what is she wearing? What's going on there?
It's like, what culture is this from? Like, and so you have to be, very clear about that early on, and like also don't shy away from, like, say the Kickstarter page, like who the cultural consultants were, what culture is it from, what kind of research or institutions or resources did you lean on to make sure that this was a tried and true tested product that is respectful and appreciative of the people and the culture, right? So yeah.
And I know, I mean, we didn't mean to talk about this, but I feel like this is very resonant with the topic. So,
Absolutely.
I want to make it very clear that when we say cultural consulting, I think that some people get a little bit, their hackles get up and they get afraid. Like you mentioned that, ask about the Kickstarter creators. There are some Kickstarter creators that might not take kindly to being asked. They might assume that like, well, you don't know what I'm talking about. What are you trying to cause trouble over here? And it's like, okay, so this is a new multicultural space. There's new voices here. There are more eyes on the product, whether you like it or not. And those voices are not going away. And those perspectives, as much as some people may want to. So I think a cultural consultant is somebody that wants to say, you know what? Okay, we're making this transition. Let's make more games. Let's make better games. This isn't about taking anything away. This isn't about, making you feel a certain way. This is about like making a product that just works for everybody. So like the best cultural consultants will tell you, this is here's the thing that you do. They don't just say no.
Yeah.
Like in your experience, right? Like you're it's not about no, it's about, okay, not this, try this.
Yeah.
And we'll go from there.
Yeah. Or, just in general, like just being, very clear about like, actually, like maybe in my culture, we don't use this mentality or language. Maybe you want to use this wording or phrasage that makes sense to, you know, the philosophy or the Confucianism or whatever it is that you're building, right? So you have to be careful of that, because it's not careful of that, but just like, you know, word it in a way that makes it thematically sound, but also just rings true to the subject matter, right? And they're just subject matter experts. Like that's really what it is. And they just make the product better, and they'll help you with the research for that too. So
and there's always a way forward. There's always a way forward. Enough creativity, enough passion. We you know, Lauren has been in this industry. XYZ Game Labs was founded in 2017. In order to be at a small company that long, you have to have passion. And you have to love this stuff, right? And so it's like, we're not out to like have takeaway games. We're out to like make this better, more, you know, like we're trying to add to, you know, what's going on.
Yeah. And a lot of cultural consultants too, they're like, this is going to be an awesome game. You know, like they want it to succeed. They want their culture to be represented. I firmly believe that. Like I was so excited when Blue's Clues hired Josh because I was like, growing up, I had not seen any Filipino role models. And I was just like, oh my God, mainstream Filipino, yes. And I was freaking out. You know, I was so amped. I was amped. And, you know, and I'm sure a lot of people feel that way too, but it's just like, you know, appreciation, pay homage to that culture and the people that, you know, you're making a game and, you know, you gain to profit off of. Realistically, that's it. And, you know, if you could do that and pay respect, oh my God, golden. Like golden. It's going to be a great game. Like,
and we get it. We get it. Culture sells. Like, you know, you throw on like Cucamonga, it won't sell. But if you go on some like real life place, or if you use real life resident, that stuff sells. So that's why people keep on doing it. So it's like, we're not trying to stop that. We're trying to just like make that work for everybody involved.
Yeah. And it can be any culture. Like Arch Ravels, knitting and crochet has a culture.
Sure.
And we did the culture research and we hired crafting consultants to make sure we nailed down that culture. So it crosses over beyond just, you know, ethnic or racial lines. It's all over. So yeah.
So that was our unplanned, unscripted advertisement for cultural consultancy. We are biased. If that felt like an ad, then too bad. We are totally into this stuff. But yeah, so I think that's definitely.
I never got paid for being a cultural consultant. I'm just very passionate about the subject and making sure that, you know, cultures are, you know, people's diversities are truly embraced and are authentic in the game, right?
Well, you should start charging. So that this is important work, and they're a good investment in your game. So okay, so we got to know a little bit about you, and we were talking before the call. I mean, it's not just our culture, right? You know, I'm Latino, I'm from Brooklyn. You're Filipina from Chicago, but we both grew up in very multicultural environments. Like Chicago, New York are two of the most multicultural cities in the entire world. And I understand you said before about the segregation. Oh yeah, we got segregation too. But like the city is so condensed that like you walk 10 blocks, you're gonna see, you know, like what did you see when you were growing up in your neighborhood in Chicago? Well, first of all, where in Chicago did you grow up?
So this is where it's interesting. So my family grew up in Albany Park and then moved in Hyde Park, which is like kind of by University of Chicago. And then my parents moved to the suburbs. And you would think, oh, suburbs, it's not very diverse. I actually lived in one of the most diverse suburbs in Chicago, to the point where like in my school, it was like 50% Black, 50% white, and like the point, you know, 2% Asian was like me and a few handful of people. and then there's more Latinos too. There's like 10% Latinos. So it was like, yeah. So like maybe like 45, whatever the math, I'm not doing math right. 10 and then like 1%.
It's all good. 2%. That's a big pie.
But like, I really was in a diverse town and it was great though. Like, you know, I got to hear so many perspectives from a lot of people, but you know, at the same time, I felt so isolated because there's so few Asians. And I think that like a lot of Asians in America are experiencing that. Like, you know, there's so few of us. Like we never mattered. And that's the thing though too, that's what hurts us. And that's why I think the Stop Asian Hate movement or Stop AAPI movement is so important, is because historically we've been statistically insignificant. And that literally means politicians or, political analysts don't care about the Asian vote in a lot of cases, and especially in elections. So, they don't need to pay attention to Asian voices or Asian concerns or whatever is going on in our, in our communities. So it's kind of at least in more modern history, one of the times where Asian culture and input and voices are so important. And at least the first time in my lifetime, and probably the first time in my parents' lifetime. So it's really really something. But yeah, growing up, because there's so few Asians, we have 50% Black, 50% white. Then you have the random people who are neither white or Black, and that leads to what they call triangulation of cultures. So essentially, you're pulled in between these two dominating forces, which is white, Black, and then our identity, the Latinos or the Asians or whoever's stuck in between, it's just doesn't exist, or has not really existed at least in media growing up, and in the in Hollywood and in culture and in representation. It just wasn't that important. So yeah, that's one thing that I noticed. I think it's getting much better for sure. We're seeing a lot more Asian actors, we're seeing a lot more Asian artists. There's a growing fan base of Korean pop fans. There's a lot. Right. I mean, Twitter is all the Korean pop fans on Twitter are awesome, but there's more of that now. But growing up, there was no voice. There was no person to really speak up for majority, or if any, all Asian Americans. And that includes the South Asians, so Indians as well. So
yeah, and I did a whole video about implicit bias and stereotypes. The whole, it was an hour. My God, God bless you if you watch the whole video, right? One of the things I pointed out was when it's not familiar, right? When you don't grow up with that in your life, right? Whether it's the Asians or the Arabs or all the different cultures, the brain is wired to kind of take shortcuts and rely on their previous judgments rather than the lived experience of the interaction. So then it goes into the topic today, which is stereotyping, and especially among Asian American women. So you just said it. Yeah, we didn't talk before. You read light to it, Lauren. Thank you so much. About Asians have been here for hundreds of years, but it was always kind of disparate. Either it was kind of ensconced in Chinatown, or just kind of frittered about, just confetti, right. Amongst everything. So it was never thriving, just Asian American communities as kind of a newish thing, right? So yeah. So many folks just haven't had the opportunity to really form their ideas. So they borrow it from what the culture gives them, and what is the culture giving us about Asian women. That's the topic.
So that, unfortunately, what we've seen, and it has happened forever, honestly, as long as Asian women have been on film, there has been a hypersexualization of Asian women. And the idea that, oh, they're just seductive, oh, they're easy to be controlled, you could just control them, or and typically those characters end up backstabbing and then getting killed, right? Because they were being sly and hypersexual and using their sexuality to try to sabotage the protagonist in some sort of way. And that's literally for the longest time, if you look at any of the black and white films that featured an Asian American woman, it is that exact subplot.
So not just the seductress, but the evil temptress.
Yes. And same thing with Asian men too. They would not necessarily, they didn't never sexualize the Asian men, but they made them also seem like, oh, slimy, like they have some shady deal, or they're doing something like they're gonna like, switch on you and backstab you in some sort of way.
Right.
But what's really bad though is really, the hypersexualization of women, of Asian women, and that, to be honest, that happens pretty much for every woman of color, especially Black women. So, but, I digress. But like literally that happens for most women of color. But, in this case from Asian women, that has been a serious thing. And honestly, it goes beyond just what the culture portrays of Asian women. It literally speaks to the history of colonization, and basically when these colonizers started taking over Asia, especially for example, in the Philippines, when the Spanish arrived, right? They stripped them of their names. They stripped them of their culture, of their clothing, of their religions, of their practices, even of their language partially, right? So there's a lot of indigeneity that took place when they stripped them of that culture. But then on top of that, they were also, taking advantage of the women, and which led to modern cases of, sex slavery and the hypersexualization of Asian women as a result of colonization, imperialism, and later on, even in World War II, when the Japanese took over, they killed the men, they killed some of the babies, but they turned the women into sex slaves. And so that history has been going on forever, and it also continued, even though, Japan lost the war. When the U.S. Took over the Philippines, there was a naval base, but at the same time, a lot of the U.S. military folks, or were not mainly there, but they're there for work, but they also were partying it up and taking advantage of, young Asian women. And so it was a constant, perpetualization of, erasing the culture of Orientalism, because they're foreign,
they're exotic,
they're exotic, all
if
that
you're saying
stuff.
the word exotic in your game, then you are going wrong. That is not a word you want in your game, just as a flag.
Yeah, like they see that as something exciting and interesting, and they're away from their families, they're away from their lives, they're thousands of miles away on a beautiful island with warm weather, and they've been taking advantage, unfortunately, of a lot of Asian women, and that happens.
You mentioned before, it happens in a lot of different cultures, right? Like, the women become kind of like appropriate, slay the men, appropriate the women. It happened, it's among my people and Tainos and everything. They wiped out all the men, and the females were all kind of like married into, the culture and everything. I guess like when it comes to Asian women in particular, I don't know if there's like a thing, and maybe you can speak more to this because you're more knowledgeable about like why Asian women just seem to play out a little bit more differently. It seems to be more playing on that kind of docility, but sexual, but also like very docile.
Yeah. Well, that's part of Confucianism, actually. Confucianism is a patriarchal system. Okay. Like the father rules the household. You must respect your elders. Women are beneath men. Like that mentality is literally, and it's crazy to think about this, but like, I consider myself Filipino. I'm not Chinese. Confucianism doesn't exist. I studied political science in college. I'm an economics political science double major, and I took an Asian political course, policy course, and political science course, and the very first thing we learned was Confucianism, because it literally drove the entire culture. across Asia, because, you know, the Chinese culture pretty much spread throughout all of Asia. And that is literally one of the pinnacles of Confucianism that has drawn, like, literally, we don't think of, I don't even think about it. Like, I never considered myself Confucian, but it's something that I was brought up to think about. And then I had to decode myself.
Well, it's like in the Western tradition, like, I'm not Greek, I'm not Roman, but like we learn, that when we first learn history, where do we start history in Western classes? We started in Greece and Rome, because our story is that culture kind of migrated from that area to Europe and we just kind of take that for granted. But it's like, that's weird when you think about it. And I feel like what you're describing, maybe the same thing happened with Confucius's ideas, where it's like, okay, it starts in like, one section of China, imperial China, and then it just like through osmosis and imperialism just kind of like spreads to places, like, Thailand and Japan and Mongolia and all these different places where, like just the like that philosophical patrimony just kind of like takes over, even where the cultures are different.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, though, but like, actually pre-colonization Philippines so before the Spanish arrived, they were actually pretty like matriarchal. Like, it was actually like pretty equal society. They had laws, they had like actual court system, they had some of the children even had rights to like vote. The literacy rate was high. They even had divorce. Like, they actually had structure, and it was a pretty advanced society. But then, you had this docile mentality, and I think that docile idea really comes from, its counterpart, like male dominance, right? And war, imperialism. Because like, in the Philippines, it was all matriarchal. Like, it was very peaceful, and the women ruled. And actually, a lot of indigenous societies were like that, right? They're run by women. Although even then, if you were a man and you wanted to be a leader of the community, you could be, if you so choose. They actually allowed that. There wasn't any that kind of segregation that we see that's kind of like ingrained in our brains, or not ingrained in our brains, but ingrained in the society, right? So it's interesting. But yeah, that docile mentality is true. And there's a lot of other instances where we see that, like, for example, in geishas, right? Geishas are supposed to be seductive and docile and whatever, but what that has translated today, and unfortunately what happened in Atlanta, is the idea of Asian women are supposed to be sexually obedient. And if not, it will lead to sexual violence and all these expectations that, like, these things are happening to me because they're tempting me, but that's not the case. Like, you don't have those kinds of rights over women no matter what. But yeah, that's one thing.
It's not, I guess, like, kind of imagining it from a male perspective, like, the further down the partner is, the further up, it makes the male feel, right? Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah, like, and that's true though. It's like the whole white knight thing. Like, I'm here to white, or what is it, white savior complex. Like, I'm here to save you from this terrible place that is impoverished, where you're impoverished and you don't have these amenities and you don't have this like fancy stuff, where it's just like, you know what, they were doing just fine before you guys arrived. Like, it was an okay society. In fact, they were very, intellectual. They actually developed a lot of interesting technologies, but the need to conquer and to strip their culture and to place Christianity on, or Catholicism onto this people, were just so strong that, like, it didn't matter what kind of terrible things they had to commit to enforce that culture and enforce that philosophy and enforce that, traditions onto them.
I think like going to the Atlanta shooting in particular, I think that there are people out there that are still having kind of a tough time, like, just kind of like, is this a hate crime? Is this did it have to be, Asian women? Like, the person said he had a sex addiction. So it's like, okay, he was doing a sex addiction. Like, okay, did it have to be Asian women? So I feel like there's still this maybe skepticism on some people that like, like, why are we combining these things? Why is it like, why
Right.
are the Asian community like kind of feel this so deeply? Right. When I
Yeah.
mean, if the person is operating out of, this other part, like, I mean, did he mean to, like, shoot Asians or whatever it is? Like, he
Yeah.
probably didn't. There was no writing about it. There was no like, like, I'm
Right.
gonna write in the wall like I hate Asian people or anything like that. So like people are, I guess, like figuring out what that disconnect is of like, why is it that like we can go from this person who didn't seem to intend it to do that, but the Asian community feels so aggrieved anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think really what was so painful about that event is that, you know, the people who worked there were predominantly Asians. Like, if you wanted to shoot up a place, right? A location, if you were to target a specific location where you're going to just shoot everyone there, right? Picking, the massage parlor, you're going to kill Asian people there. And like, especially if it's Asian owned, especially if it's like, it's tied to a specific culture that happens to own the business. It's like, going to, I don't know, I don't want to make comparison, but like, going to like maybe like a Latino grocery store and shooting up the Latino grocery store. You're going to be killing Latinos at that grocery store, like, and so that's what was so painful, is because it's happening all at a time, at the same time, where we're seeing elderlies getting beat up on the street just for for no reason, just for being Asian. Like, they're getting beat up. And now, like, Chinatown has been patrolled by younger, healthier, more physically capable, individuals to protect elderly Asians who are just trying to live their life. Like, my mom is scared to even go out for a walk on her nature trail because she just like doesn't know who's out there. And it's literally created so much anger, like the coronavirus, and of course the
Right.
the news networks, the demagogues who've just been talking about or blaming Asian Americans have been really escalated the pain. Right. And I think, and to go back on the Atlanta stuff though, like, when I think what was so hurtful when he also said that it was because he had a sexual addiction, it's because it was as if, one, he was not taking accountability for the fact that it really was because they're Asian, and two, he was also, it was like him saying that it was a sexual addiction was a way to make it like, oh, like, you should, it's not that bad. It was because there were women that I acted like this. It's not because they're Asian.
It's their fault.
It's not because they're Asian I killed them. It's because they're women, and that's why I wanted to kill them.
In the sex trade, like that is their choice to be in the sex trade. So I'm going to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So so I think that was so hurtful because it's like, no, like, are you saying that it's more acceptable now because the reason why you did this horrific thing is because they're women and you have a sexual addiction? No, it doesn't make it better. It makes it much worse because he literally is just like, well, they're just women. It's just like objectifying women, and it doesn't matter. And that's why I did that. It's not because of everything that's going on with the Asian hate crimes or attacks that are happening across the country.
Yeah, and one thing I was reflecting on since my conversation with Sen, because I got some, people talking, agreeing or disagreeing or whatever it is, and I was thinking about it, and it's like, okay, it's Atlanta. Atlanta has sex all over the place. Like, you could either some of the most famous strip clubs in the world are in Atlanta, and there's hookers in the street, and that, not to like demean that, but like there's literally sex everywhere, and the person specifically targeted two different establishments that were massage parlors. And so, and you could see the map. He drove through places. So it's like, okay, why, he drove there and he drove there. So like, there's all sorts of stuff in the between where he could have stopped. And, anybody he wanted, like anywhere. But the target was Asians, and that's why
and
I really.
He could have gone to a porn star, like a
peep
like
show,
a video store,
porn shop, or what? There's also
any other places where he'd be relieved of whatever sexual frustration. It doesn't like he could have gone anywhere, yet he chose those two places where they're predominantly Asian. And yeah, that's one thing though. Like it's gonna be like that's where it's going to be kind of challenging, honestly, legally to prove that it was a hate crime, is because
at the end of the day, it's like, I mean, I don't really care whether it's proven legally. I mean, it's just like how we talk about it, in a culture. And it's like, okay, is the Asian American, is there a problem, right? I think that's what it comes down to, right? Is there a problem? Like we talk about Stop Asian Hate, and then there's a question of, well, how bad is it? Is the media gaslighting us, or is there a real problem with Asian hate? And I think, and I don't want to indulge that too much, because I think we both think that there is a problem, but just to kind of like, to center what I'm sure you're dealing with in terms of resistance. And why you feel like you have to speak up, use your voice, and have to explain it, because you're cutting against this headwind of, is there really that much of a problem? Have you encountered that in, kind of your thinking and your interactions?
I mean, like, I feel like that I don't know. For me, I feel like it's more clear cut that he totally was like premeditated in this event, and he even sat in the parking lot for a long time. So it's just like he had every opportunity to walk away and to have a bad day. Like everyone has bad days. It doesn't excuse that. But I feel like there is a real problem that's going on, with the overall dialogue and rhetoric around anti-Asian sentiment. Like I was called coronavirus last year while I was out on a run.
Wow.
Like I literally was called that, and like my parents and literally all my family except for me and my brother, they're all in healthcare. So while they're working their butts off and suiting up and wearing their N95s and wearing a scrub mask and completely protecting themselves with gear for long hours and trying to treat COVID-19 patients, they're putting themselves at risk. Yet it's the Asian community that's being targeted and blamed for and scapegoated for this virus. And it's just like, it really upsets me. And that's what really just messes me up, because my entire family is at risk. They expose themselves they're at risk of exposure every single day. Yet, we have these people who would rather, turn this into hey, let's hate on China for stealing our jobs sort of rhetoric, or let's blame the shady government, or let's do that. But it's just like, a lot of the Asian Americans who are here and who are working and who've been Americans and are true Americans are being victims of this, are the ones who are being who are really feeling the impacts of that rhetoric. Like it's so hard. It's been incredibly challenging for the last year and a half. And I can't even, I feel so bad for my parents, because they're up in age and they're doing this and they showed up to work and they're physicians and they have to literally see patients and determine whether or not they have COVID or not, and they're that close to the virus, and they can't even go out for a walk on their nature trail because of these events. And it's just so heartbreaking, because I know that they work so hard And, and I was also raised by my grandparents. So seeing all these videos of elderly getting beat up has been so heartbreaking for me, because like I have such a soft spot for old people, and they're just so innocent. Like they don't know, most of them don't even like speak English. They're just trying to like live their lives, and there's just like there's no I don't know, there's no sanctity in it. Like beating up old people, like why? There's like no point in it. And that's another thing though too. It's just like it's the vulnerable that's being attacked, right? It's the less able. So you're dealing with, the elderly, women, or if it's like or if it's dealing with other groups, they're bringing guns to those fights, right? So it's just like, it's very cowardly. Oh, really? Like when you think about it. And I've seen a decrease, I think, slightly, not too much, but a decrease of anti-Asian related crime and hate and assault/violence. But
there's been a big outcry.
There's been an outcry, and there's been people patrolling. And the moment you have younger, more physically capable Asian men who have I don't know, maybe they have some sort of background in mixed martial arts, whatever, you're not seeing crimes anymore. But it's when it's someone who's walking by themselves, like that Filipino lady in New York City who was 65 years old, who was just walking to church. Like that was literally my mom. That's literally my, like, Filipino, 65 years old, on her way to church. That I could be describing my mom. And yeah, it's just like when they're by themselves, unfortunately, you have people who will take advantage of their vulnerable state.
Right.
So.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there is like, you don't want it to be you, right? And there's like a big, there's just so much empathy when it comes to that. And it's like, you could say, okay, well, it's just a drop in the bucket. There's the bad things that happen every day, but it's like, it doesn't make me feel better knowing that, I just have this natural empathy thing, of like, that could be your grandma. And, I'm a Puerto Rican person, but, my family tends to have Asian features. My grandma, God rest her soul, she's in heaven now, but like, she worshiped Buddha, and she looked like a little Filipino woman herself. And it's like, yeah, I can't not, have that reaction. And I'll try to like be reasonable and look at the stats and everything, but it's like that cloud there's a miasma out there, right? Of like, of hate, of fear. I'll say that there's a miasma of fear of like, okay, what are they bringing? What are they, what are they coming on? What are they doing? And that's what kind of the purpose of these videos, the one with Sen, and thank you for coming on, is to kind of like just talk, like, put words to that. And if they're not all the right words, and I mean, we're doing the best that we can, right? But there's something out there, right? There's a miasma out there, and we're trying to articulate what it is, how it's impacting us, and try to, whoever of goodwill would want to like just come along with us on this journey to, listen to us and help us out. And I say us, like, obviously I'm not like, I'm not Asian. It's an Asian moment, but like I've been there too. Like, I mean, like a couple of years ago, it was like it was a man going into in Texas, like shooting up a Walmart because all the Mexicans were there. And like shooting them because the Mexicans, they're an infestation, they're an invasion. So like, I can't not make that association for myself, of like, someone who is shot because of an immutable characteristic, nothing that can change. We can't change our ethnicities. We can't change how we look. I can't change my color of my skin. And the idea that there are people out there who are armed and who have, some kind of ideas, that's, I don't know. It's hard to let go.
Yeah, it's very challenging. And and I hope though that if there's one thing that can happen out of this, it means that maybe Asian voices will be listened to more, because honestly, like, that really has not happened. I have not and I've studied American politics in the history of America. Really, there really hasn't been a moment for Asian voices to kind of stand up for themselves, because again, we're supposed to be docile, we're supposed to be polite, we're supposed to be quiet, we're supposed to not speak up when things are wrong, and that goes a lot of ways with the overall immigrant experience. Like, for example, like, not to continuously drop personal stories, but like, if someone's disrespecting my family at the grocery store, I'm like ready to talk to them. And my mom, it's like, you're disrespecting my mom. But like, my mother and like my family, they're like, no, be quiet. Shh, nothing happened. And they don't want to fight, or they don't want to stand up for themselves, because, who knows what their green card status is, right? Who knows, right, like if they're trying to work towards their naturalization, like, so there is a barrier there to voice out and protect yourself, because you're vulnerable, because of your citizenship status, right? Or even if you're a sex worker, right? You don't want to call the cops. Like, the cops will make things worse, in a lot of situations. So, these vulnerable groups are not protected under the law, to be honest. And because of that, they're just, they just take, they're a freaking punching bag, and, they can't stand up for themselves in these instances. And but now you're seeing a lot of first generation Asian Americans, and I'm 1.5 technically. My dad was born here, so he's kind of rare. But so now you're seeing a lot people who are a lot more vocal, who are Asian American, who will speak up, who will not shy away from this hate. Like, it's not the 30s anymore, okay? Like, they're educated, they've lived here, they have established roots here. You can't just ostracize Asian Americans.
And from what I experienced among some of my friends that I know, it's like they did the things. They what were they told? Come here, get a job, go to college, 2.5, acculturate, and you'll melt right in, melting pot. And like, I think a lot of Asian Americans are discovering that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we did, all the things, and we're still getting it anyway.
Exactly. And that's one thing I'm so glad my parents kind of educated me on this. And she said, Lauren, you know what people are going to see when they look at you? They're going to see that you are Asian. Do not forget that. You are Asian. And do you know what they're going to assume? They're going to assume that you're not from here, okay? And it was like one of those, like, not sit down talks, but, like one of those life lessons, like, you've got to never forget that. They're going to assume that you're not from here. They're going to assume, they're going to see that you're an Asian American or an Asian person. They're going to assume you might not know the language. And like, it's so weird too. Like, I get like really weird like encounters where like, wow, your English is so good. It's just like, I was born here. I was educated here. Like, what do you think? My English is so good. Like, why? And so, it still happens every once in a while, and where people just like want to think that I'm not they still don't think I'm an American, essentially. And that's really what it is that the simulation can never happen so long as I look the way I look. And that happens for a lot of Asians, unfortunately. And, so that melting pot, like you said, doesn't happen for us, right? It's a dream. It's not true.
Right. Let's I want to go back to the discussion of female Asian stereotypes, because we talked about the history, like how it kind of began, and like I think that becomes a thing where it's like, some people feel it's like, okay, you're talking about this old stuff, and yes, we were terrible. We know about the internment, we know about all these things, right? And then, but we've gotten better. right? We've gotten better. We can love who we love. We can marry who we love. And so we've gotten better. So it's like, why are we kind of like dredging some of this stuff up, right? And, so the answer I think has to do with, okay, there's not a lot of like, there's less like active stuff happening, but like it emerges in the way we think and the stereotypes that are still persistent. So maybe talk a little bit about like Asian stereotypes, like in our community, gaming, and what you have seen, how that has persisted, and what you see.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to call out, specifics per se, but I have seen artwork where it wasn't necessarily how I would expect to draw myself as an Asian woman. That could be one instance where it's just like, come on, like, does this character have to wear this outfit? I wouldn't wear this outfit if I'm about to enter in war or if I'm about to fight someone. Like, is this really what it has to be? But also too, like, there's some other stereotypes of like, like, for example, in a lot of in the Asian culture, there's like, the stereotype of drugs, right? And drug usage. And that's another one, which is like, that's
opium,
not
poppy. Yeah.
Oh yeah. The opium and poppy, like, that's not really what we're about. And it's really, and what's a shame though, is that it's false narrative, right? It's erasing the actual true Asian culture. And when you're doing that, it's just like, okay, it's cultural hegemony, right? You're taking over someone else's culture and erasing it and rewriting it in a way that is stereotypical and bad and not really authentic, and leads to the whole, Orientalism, if you will, right? Because it is a Western perspective of Eastern culture, Asian culture. And so, yeah, so I'm tying all these like words together.
I think we used the word Orientalism. I think, I don't know if I've really explained it. Orientalism is this idea that like, okay, there's a center and there's like Western European, and then kind of the further out you go, the more kind of mythical and exotic, we use that word,
or
and
fantasy, or
right.
like,
and like essential, like, so like essentialized. So it's like, okay, Chinese folks are this, and then African folks are this. Where like, we don't say like white folks are this or European folks are this. Like, like we individuate a lot more. Like, but you go out to the rings, like further out from the center, and it becomes more essentialized. It becomes more like, okay, all Asian women are this, and all but they're always docile, they're always this, whether it's a geisha, whether it's a Filipina girl, whether it's it's all kind of like, because they're that category, they have XYZ ABC 1 2 3. And it's usually like this fantastical thing, Arabian Nights, and all those kind of like fantastical stories. So like that's kind of what we mean by Orientalism. And obviously, I'm covering over a whole scholarship when it comes to that stuff. But I guess that's the main thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I see that too, where like, I don't know. For example, in some games, like there may be an Asian theme. I don't know if anyone Asian was involved in the project. Like, it's not very obvious to me, or they kind of tuck that or hide that under the FAQs of the Kickstarter page. But it's just like, why would you hide that information? Like, or if you're making a game about a culture that's like not really your culture, like, who did you consult with on that? And that's the problem. It's like, it's almost it's like Asian fetishism, but like on a thematic board game thematic level, right? It's just like so many of them. It's just like, but like, I look at the game and I look at the information, I'm like, okay, like, is there anyone Asian involved in this project? And it's really disheartening, because it's just like, wow, like they've really stolen or exploited a culture and did not think about the Asian people, the Asian audiences who are looking at this, who are like, wow, there wasn't anyone involved from this game, and it's my culture, right? So it's really hurtful, because it's just like, again, it's going back to the whole cultural consultant. Like, it can't, you have the internet now. There's no excuse. Like, you could find someone, you can hire someone. It's to me, it's like not like an easy step. It's never easy to hire a cultural consultant. There will be uncomfortable conversations. I think those are life lessons that you can learn from those conversations. And I think that it is a worldly view that'll overall help you and nurture you as a better version of yourself as a human being and a game designer. But it's like, it's like the most essential step, when you're making it. It's like the most basic step of like designing a game that is not necessarily of your culture. It's like,
especially like if you're kind of like developing the thematics of it, right?
Right.
And that representation. I had a thought as you were talking about like, kind of drilling down on some of the like you mentioned before, like the drugs and stuff. Like another thing that recurs a lot is the female student.
Mm-hmm.
That trope. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about like where that came from and why that particular thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one because honestly, I totally was that trope growing up. I was a big nerd. I studied really hard, but it's also the idea that, it comes from, I believe that trope really comes from, the Asian American experience and Asians trying to assimilate in this country. And really they realize that, okay, like the way to get out of this being the lower class or being sub quote unquote like caste of human beings in this country is you have to get an education. You have to do well in school. And it was ingrained in me growing up. My parents were so strict on me about school. They were like,
and that's also a Confucian thing.
Like, and that's also a Confucian thing too. Like you have to educate, you have to work hard. You do not get anywhere in your life unless you input this, that, and that. But it's also, the Asian and especially the first generation Asian American thing where, the families are like, you want to work hard in this life, you have to really hit the books. And my parents would say that, like, hit the books, like every day. And I guess too, in a more modern political analysis of that, like, affirmative action. A lot of people think that Asians benefit from affirmative action. That is not true. Asian Americans do not benefit at all from affirmative action. And so they have to work harder because they are dealing with racial discrimination when they're being interviewed. A lot of times there's like there's studies actually where if a college admissions person is interviewing the student, if they happen to be Asian, there's some bias where they think that the student is awkward and weird, and so therefore less likely to be admitted compared to the
good at math, not good at artsy stuff, bad athlete, like all that stuff is kind of rattling around.
Right. Or like, socially awkward. They don't have the social skills. So therefore, compared to another student who is probably equal in terms of grades and extracurriculars and so on and so forth, or SAT score, if they're white and they seem to be more culturally assimilated to this country / less awkward, they're less likely to be admitted to those colleges. And what's so sad about affirmative action, though, is it really hurts that idea that that affirmative action supports Asian people, which actually it doesn't. We do not benefit at all from affirmative action. It actually hurts the other minorities, the other people of color who are trying to get into schools. So, for example, really fun fact: in California, I think it was 2011, there was a study where these parents were being surveyed, and these parents were, they're being interviewed and asking, do you support affirmative action, right? Majority of the white parents did not support affirmative action. And then they did another group, they interviewed another group, and then they informed them, hey, just so you're aware, these are the ethnic groups that are going to be benefited from affirmative action. Do you support affirmative action? And majority actually did support affirmative action because they realized that their kids would not be competing with Asian Americans.
Wow.
So what that means is that, Black kids, Hispanic kids, all these other groups of kids are their support for affirmative action is being decreased because of that racial stereotype that, Asian Americans are so good at math. They're so good at everything. They're so good at academics. Like, they're like machines when it comes to SAT score, taking SAT tests and ACTs. All these other groups who are, disproportionately, disadvantaged, right, are actually not getting the support that they need, like affirmative action from all these other communities. So it's really,
well, I have
really
a lot of criticism of affirmative action, believe me. I mean, the way it's implemented, it's kind of like, I get what it's trying to do, but it's being, and we don't want to take this too far afield. I mean, this is another conversation, but just basically the idea that like the way it's playing out is kind of pitting groups against one another. Like they're saying, the way Sen put it was, okay, we have this very limited resource, these very limited spots in these areas. And now we've constructed these things that make us compete, where we're leaving other structures under, and we're not just like, increasing the spots. There's a lot of things that we're not doing. There's a lot of things we're not doing. So I don't want to take it too far afield.
No, I 100% agree. Like that goes to, the model minority theory, right? Like, like there's all these assumptions that, for example, all Asians are crazy rich Asians. That's not true. Like actually, majority in New York City are, it's the elderly Asians who are the lowest income generators. So like and we don't hear those stories, right? And that's another thing where media does a bad job. They don't look at the holistic view of, Asian Americans. And they also, in a lot of times in Hollywood, there's a little bit of colorism, right? They don't highlight darker Asians on film. And so, that idea of model minority really hurts so many communities, and it hurts the Asian community too. It's just that a lot of people think like, oh, well, you're doing great because you're the model minority. I was like, actually, that's not really true. Like, this is what people assume a lot of things about me that are not true. And, or people, expect certain things from me. And it's like, actually, no, I'm going to speak out against that, your racism, right? I'm not going to be quiet. I'm not going to be docile. Like, I'm not going to be the model minority who just like is a punching bag. Like, I'm actually going to speak out. And so, slowly the new generation of Asian Americans are stripping that model minority myth because it has been so damaging. And quite frankly, like, I've kind of sort of seen it from my family, especially the elderly people. They're just trying to play nice, play safe, don't get in trouble, all that stuff. But things are going to change, and things are changing, which I think is important because, before they didn't have a voice, and it was painful for them, and I think damaging to them too. But, yeah.
And speaking out is what Good Trouble is all about. And so,
yeah.
And I'm going to try to get, voices from all corners, and all genders and everybody in between. So thank you so much for providing, a different perspective. I mean, we can't cover everything, and nobody can cover everything. That's kind of the point, right? I mean, so I definitely, I was telling Lauren before the call, telling you, but like, that's the kind of bravery use, like kind of just, email me, like, oh, have me on your show. But like, really, like, I really do welcome, especially folks that are like inside the gaming community, inside the gaming industry. Like, please reach out to me if they, whatever perspective, obviously, we're talking about hashtag Stop Babies Hate. And I'm, I certainly believe there's a problem, and I certainly want to contribute to solutions. But if there's a certain thing that I'm doing, or there's a certain kind of idea that's like, oh, well, let's talk about this, please, I'm right there. Jason Perez. I'm right there. She found me, or you could find me too.
Yes. If I could do it, you can do it.
Right. So Lauren, this was amazing. Please, let's close it out by telling us about, future. The future for you. So like, I mean, you seem like,
Yeah.
you know, with we talked about cultural consultancy many times. So I have a feeling it's just going to be a part of your future for a long time. Yeah, let's get those rates up over here a little bit more than free. You're worth it. You are absolutely worth it. Your time is worth it.
I've been doing it mainly for XYZ, and then like
Okay.
if friends have
Oh yeah,
questions,
sure. Yeah.
like I'll I'll help a friend out, here and there. And I will chime in on some things that are like, hey, you might want to reconsider that one. But, I haven't actually ever formalized cultural consultancies, although I'm very passionate about, respecting cultures and diversity and representation and making sure that the world is seen as a inclusive and diverse place as it is, like in our games, because like people want to see that, people want to see themselves in their games, so it's really important to include that design. But yeah, but in terms of just XYZ stuff, like, I enjoy uncomfortable conversations. So I'm not uncomfortable conversations, but important conversations that a lot of people might have a hard time articulating or discussing about. So if you have any questions on things that are just a little tricky or whatever, like let me know, or ask to be on Jason's show because it's you can learn so much. But yeah, and in terms of like project work, our travels is available now, which is a knitting and crochet themed board game, and we have a Kickstarter that's coming up soon, which also includes some diverse folks in the game, so we're really excited about that.
And I'm learning too, like I never made that link to, like, I'd studied Confucianism. I was a religion major in college, but I'd never really made those links about how that philosophical patrimony kind of like slid in. So as soon as you said it, I'm like, whoa.
Right? Like, okay, so I'm so glad you said that, because I don't consider, like, as an Asian person, I never considered myself to be Confucian, right? I'm
But
like,
yeah.
who's Confucian? I'm like, I was technically baptized Roman Catholic, okay? Like, who's like, I'm not Confucian. And then when my my professor started like walking through Confucianism and how that impacts actually Asian Chinese American relations and Chinese politics and their way of thinking and their way of approach and the history there, I was like, oh my God, I was raised Confucian. Like, I had no idea. I honestly, like, I used to butt heads so hard with my family, and it made so much sense. Like, it actually taught me so much and made me empathize a lot with my family and like how they're raised. And it's just like, it's not their fault. Like, it's systemic, right? Like, that's how you know it's a systemic ideology, because like, they don't consider themselves Confucian, but it's there. It exists and it persists for generations and generations to come. And so, it's so if you're Asian, look up Confucianism so you can understand your parents, understand your upbringing, because it opened up doors for me.
And if you're into games, these conversations and different cultural patrimonies, blah blah blah, hire a cultural consultant and all that good stuff. So thank you so much, Lauren, for reaching out. Please do not be a stranger.
Absolutely. I love the show, and thank you so much for having me.
If you could change your mind, you could change the world. So until next time, later, everybody.
Bye.